Hey, it's Alex here. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you that this episode of the New Stack Makers is part of our second season of the Tech Founder Odyssey. We're so excited about this series that we're doing with tech founders. We're going to hear from more founders as they share how they've launched their venture, what they've learned from their successes, and how the pitfalls along the way have helped shape the way they run their company. I'm very interested in how they came up with this idea. What were the challenges? Those are the kind of things you're going to hear in these stories. So I'm hosting the first episode, and then we'll be handing it off to the awesome Heather Jocelyn and awesome as well Colleen Call for the rest of season 2. We've got some great guests lined up, so please stay tuned. You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Tech Founders Odyssey series, part of the New Stack Makers podcast. I'm your host, Heather Jocelyn of TNS, and I'm joined today, as always, by my co-host and colleague, Colleen Call. Hi, Colleen.
Hello, Heather. Happy to be here, as always.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you here. Today, we're going to chat with Sargun Kaur, co-founder and CEO of Byteboard, the company she started in 2018 with fellow Google employee Nicole Hardson-Hurley. Byteboard has created a project-based technical interview that is used by customers like Dropbox, Lyft, and Robinhood to help make their hiring processes more efficient and more equitable. In 2020, its co-founders won a 30 Under 30 award from Forbes magazine for enterprise technology. We'll be talking today not only about Sargun's personal journey, but also the issue of tech interviews and how they can be better. That's something I'll bet all of you who are listening to this can relate to. Welcome, Sargun.
Thank you. Really excited to talk about my journey building this.
Well, let's get to it. I did my homework, and it looks like you graduated from high school in San Jose, which would make you sounds like you were a child of Silicon Valley.
510 number through and through.
Okay, cool. Are your parents in tech?
Yeah. So the high school I went to, while called Mission San Jose, was actually based out of Fremont, which is literally the heart of the Bay Area in many ways, central to San Jose, central to San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And I am a child of immigrants. My dad moved here because he was the one and only at that time from his town in northern India to get a job, a tech job in the United States. So he moved out here, and then my mom and I followed soon after. Mm-hmm. My dad was an engineer at the time, gone into management since then. And I've always seen my dad work in these black box terminals. Back then, Silicon Valley looked different. There weren't slides and free food and all these fun offices. My dad's office very much was a cubicle that I would go and visit. And I was like, cool, mm-hmm. I'm never going to do that. That's one career that does not sound appealing to me at all. He would come home and work on his computer and be like, that sounds so boring. And so I was a kid who loved a number of different things. My mom was a teacher. She was very creative at home. I loved art. I pursued journalism in high school, was the editor of my school paper. So I had all of these fascinating different interests. And from the checklist, it was thankfully very clear to me that at least I could check off engineering as a department I was not going to go into at all. Mm-hmm. So clearly a big arc somewhere in the middle where I ended up exactly the model child of engineering for my parents ultimately. But it wasn't a clear path by any means.
And where did you reach the turning point to go into computers?
So I got into Berkeley, again, very much a California child, all the way from preschool to college to my internships to now have been in the 510 area code. I applied as an environmental science major. So in addition to pursuing journalism in high school, I was driving to northern San Francisco to go and study like environmental science. I had an internship with a scientist up there, and for 2 years, as a high school student, I was like very much involved in environmental studies, and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. So applied to Berkeley as an environmental science major. Got to second semester of OChem and was like, yeah, this is not it. This is not fun by any means. I didn't like the memorization that was involved with so much of the studies involved there. And so I started to explore other pathways and other careers. Only the thing was I liked being active. I liked doing so many different things. As a journalist, I was going out and talking to people. I was writing, I was creating. Like there were just so many different parts of my brain that were constantly being used. And for me to center into one thing was really, really difficult. Unfortunately, they were going to kick me out of college if I didn't declare a major. So it was junior year, first semester. I remember going into kind of the records office very clearly and having to declare a major. And I had convinced myself at that point, after trying out a number of different classes and talking to different people, that I'd taken a 2-unit class on like very, very basics on coding at that point, like as a side course.
Oh, nice.
And through that course, we got to go visit Microsoft in person. So I got to go shadow an engineer. And she happened to be an engineer on PowerPoint. And I know I don't use PowerPoint as much anymore, but at that point, PowerPoint was like in many ways the bane of my existence. For a lot of classes, I would be using it. And so to me, the click of like, wait, you made that button that like when I click this happens, like this thing appears, like, oh, like I never really put that 2 and 2 together. Like someone was making the buttons or the things happen online in the back end. Like someone was doing that. And so that really piqued my interest of like that creation mode. And then I took this 2-unit class on like, and you know how they teach you coding when you're like such a beginner, it's like, can you make this game? Can you make this thing go left 2 buttons? And you're like, turn left times 2. And like, that's really how they get you into coding at that point. I was like, this is what like they teach 5-year-olds how to code. Like that's what I was doing.
So in a sense, Microsoft introduced you to computers and coding.
For definitely, I think that shadow engineer program, and particularly having a female engineer, I think like at that point I didn't put 2 and 2 together, but like seeing her in her element. And I forget.
Oh, so your shadow was female. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's nice. That's back in the day. Yeah, that's kind of that's remarkable.
It was through the Society of Women Engineers. It was through that club at Berkeley. And so that really got me to thinking. I was like, okay, I need to declare a major. Don't know which direction I'm going to. At the base of it, everything is rooted in tech these days. Like no matter what direction I go to, a lot of it is being, the source of it seems to be tied to tech in some ways. Even if I turned around and went into fashion or something, like there's like this like base foundation that would still take me really far, was like the thinking in my head. And so I went ahead and just declared CS after taking a 2-unit class, knowing I wanted to graduate on time. And we won't go too much into the next 3 semesters of college. They were very, very hard. The class sizes were like 700, 800 kids. 90% of them were men. Feels like to me 100% minus me were students who had like started to code when they were 5, and I was just coming into it. And so it was really, really difficult. And like keeping that steady sight to like, this doesn't have to be my be all and end all. Like I can use this foundation to go and create and go pursue any one direction was really, really what held me through.
That's interesting because it does seem like when we talk to sometimes when we not so much the founders come to think of it. A lot of people do come to it a bit later in life, but yeah, it does seem to be the common story of developers and engineers that they started coding, as soon as they could walk practically. So, so I want to fast forward a little bit. you're out in the working world. You're interviewing for jobs. I know you spent some time at Yahoo. You spent quite a few years at Google, eventually ending up as an engineering manager there. So presumably you've been on both sides. You've been on both sides of the interview process. Um, can you tell us about like your experience with the issue of the problem of tech interviews, or with tech interviews, that made you start to realize like this is a problem that needs to be solved?
Yeah. And I'll walk back a little bit because I think this is an important part to the story. When I was applying to jobs, and I graduated a semester early because I really just like wanted to get out of school at that point. So
get away from those coding classes,
right?
Don't truly recommend that. But at that point, I was just really good at studying.
What?
There's books for specifically on how to interview. Like you study this book cover to cover, and you just do every problem, like interview problem out there. And so you like build a course around it. It's like a whole course that you take. And so I'd stacked up my interviews. I interviewed for 3 months. The last interview and company I was interviewing for was Google. So at that point, I was like in the zone, of like what to expect and how to perform. But Google was still a long shot for me. It was, a lot of times it's like you've done internships at Google and then you get converted to a full-time employee. And I had not done internships anywhere close to a company like Google. And so when I got to my interviews at Google, I remember I got to the onsite, and I remember there's, particularly out of the 5 on-site interviews I had, all in front of a whiteboard with a marker, just like regurgitating like this information back to the interviewer. There was a question I got asked that I just forgot to memorize. Like there was this like one particular algorithm. I knew exactly what it was. I remember what chapter in the book it was, and I just like blanked out, forgot to memorize that. And I didn't end up getting an offer from Google. They were like, you were a borderline. We got to hiring committee. You showed a lot of potential, but like you didn't ace it. And I was like, no shock there. I'm going to move on with my life. Like it was great to go visit campus, go see the bikes, get to be even close to the Google vicinity at that point, because it was such a dream job of mine. And then I went ahead and went to work at Yahoo for a few months. But then the recruiter called back and said, hey, we're actually starting a program for new grads to get to try on different residencies, you could say, on different teams. So you showed a lot of potential. This is a highly competitive program, but if you can do one more interview, we'll see if you want to participate, if you want to participate in this program. I did another interview and I ended up getting in and had like the best learning year, like that first post year after new grad at Google, and did really, really well, and went on to become an engineer on the Google Photos team, and just got promoted, like did really, really well on the job. And now this comes back to your question of, as an engineering manager and being on the flip side, I started to sit on hiring committees and started to see profiles of candidates that looked very similar to me, right? Like really strong potential, but there was this one interview that like they completely bombed, or you could tell like they were struggling in that environment, that this like artificial environment of walking into a room and speaking in front. Typically for someone that looks like me, you're being interviewed by someone that does not look like you at all, does not come from the same background. So you're just, there's this power dynamic. There's so much going on. And at that time, I was starting to also go out and speak to a ton of schools about my own experiences. I was mentoring a ton of students, particularly women at the time, and women of color, of like how to get to Google. That was a big question, and really helping them prep with their interviews. And I remember distinctly a friend of mine who was a self-taught engineer, but brilliant, had started 2 companies, just like extremely brilliant, was looking to join. And I was like, you need to work at Google. Like this will be such a big stepping stone for you. And for 3 months, every Saturday morning for 3 hours, I would physically take a whiteboard and a marker to our local cafe, and we would sit there and work on problems together. And just like to set up that artificial environment. And we did that for 3 months. He got to the phone screen, and just the question and how it was presented at that time during the Google phone screen, it wasn't a good match. Like he didn't even end up passing through the phone screen. He's like, I don't know what they were asking. And I know him to be an extremely smart, and he's like a staff level engineer at a really high tech company today. And that always was central to like, something's not working here. Something is leaving a number of great candidates off of this pipeline. It's leaving them like, it's not even letting them shoot their shot, to say, fairly through the process. And that was fundamentally because how we were interviewing, how the industry had come up with this practice of very artificially focusing on theoretical questions, focusing on interview styles that didn't reflect what engineers did on the job. And as an engineering manager, like, your one and only job is to hire, right? Like, hire, retain, and like do well for your team. And you're spending all these hours upon hours interviewing and assessing candidates. And on-site to off-site, so the number of, for example, candidates that you interview on-site and then ultimately you give an offer to, the industry average for it is 20%. So that means like 4 to 5 candidates that you bring on-site and do a 6-hour round of interviews with, you're not even giving an offer out to. And then on top of that, the projection of mishires is so high in the industry. Oftentimes, 1 out of 4 candidates that you're 1 out of 4 people that you're bringing on ends up being a mishire. They're not ramping up fast enough. They're not well equipped for the project that you have in scope. And you're wasting so many resources because of doing a misaccurate job on the assessment piece. And that's really the idea of Byteboard came to be. There was such a clear problem in this space, and we just weren't doing a good job, and the interview process was completely broken.
Yeah, we were on a list of our questions. So why are tech interviews usually so terrible? I think you probably hit that. But the mishiring is very interesting. I'm sure this is probably as to why the concept of Byteboard began. But if you could like maybe focus like on that part of your journey of starting Byteboard, what exactly was the focus of having a mishire? Other than, like what you explained, they were missing, the theoretical questions and this and that, and they weren't getting to the focus of who these people really were. And I don't know. Just explain that, because mishiring is a really good soundbite that I would love to hear.
I'll offer up this example and let me know if this hits.
Okay.
So I'm in Oakland right now. I'm a big Warriors fan, and it's a clear example of like, if you had someone like Steph Curry and you went out and you're trying to poach him to play for the Warriors or whatever other team, hopefully no other team's poaching him. You're not going to put him in a room like this and be like, okay, Steph Curry, go and draw me like 3-point plays. Draw me how we're going to win the championship. Like that, I want you to draw that playbook on a whiteboard, and that's how I'm going to assess if you're the right fit for this team. What you're going to do is you're going to see him play on court. You're going to see how he interacts. Does he move the ball around? Where does he take his shots? Like, how does he improve throughout the game, right? Like, that's what you're really going to assess on to see if he's a capable player for your team. And now how typical engineering interviews are run traditionally is they'll put you in a room and they'll ask you to write up algorithms in a completely green space without any of that context of how do you work with others? How do you work within an existing code base? How do you build upon something that's broken? How do you prioritize? How do you ask questions? And if you're rooting how you're assessing someone based on factors that don't apply to on the job, your likelihood of having a mishire goes up a ton because you're not actually assessing for the right things. And that was that's what leads to that crux of the mishire. With a Byteboard interview, we're doing a project-based interview. We're doing an interview that simulates playing on the court. You start with a design doc that's like, here's what we're building. Your teammate left halfway through. This is what they had so far. What are the trade-offs we should be taking a look at to understand what we should build? There's no right or wrong answer here. You could argue for option A, you could argue for option B. It's the downward implications for the team that you then sort through. Similarly for part 2 of our interview, it's an existing code base. Hey, there's code written already by your team. There's some features that have been left out. Can you go and implement them within the existing infrastructure, which is a lot of what I did as an engineer. I would spend more than half my time, not just like writing up new code, I'd be like, I worked at Google and I probably learned how to build parts of Google products and feature by Googling things myself, right? Like I was like constantly looking up, like, how do I build this? Like, what should I be doing this? Like, it's about asking the right questions and knowing how to ask those right questions to lead you into what you're building. And that's really, if you have a better way of assessing and drive more confidence that what I'm assessing for relates to how this person will be performing on the job, it leads to better outcomes for the candidates. It leads to better outcomes for the business, and it leads to better outcomes for the hiring managers.
I noticed that on your LinkedIn, like there's some overlap between starting your company and the end of your leaving Google. How did you decide to make Byteboard your full-time job?
A great story. So Byteboard's origin was pretty unique and in some ways serendipitous. I was loving my time on the Google Photos team as an engineer. Personally, never thought I could go and start a company. I was like, I can't imagine myself at a company less than 500 people because, like, what if I don't know something? What if I, just like don't know how to build something? I'm in a good spot. I have like really good mentorship. I've got a team that I really like. And this problem presented itself so clearly. And Google at that time had an incubator called Area 120. Effectively, you got to be a Google engineer, like you got to keep your Google role, but full time, you got to go and build and work on an idea and project. And so I happened to apply off a whim of like, this is a really clear problem. We're going to go present this, go pitch this. And what really intrigued me was, I've always had this inclination of wanting to do many different things, like wear many different hats. I've always been super creative and a builder and an organizationally really, really inclined to want to work on multiple different things and have multiple roles. Ended up applying and getting funding for this project. And had told no one at that point. This was like very much a side thing that was happening. It was like after work at 6 p.m. would get a conference room and just like work on this. And at that point, it didn't feel like a huge decision because I got to still be at Google. I built this. Yeah. I built Byteboard for the first 3.5 years at Google. And the idea never presented itself to go and pursue this individually, go on the outside, quote unquote, and start it from scratch. And I grew tremendously in those 3 years, right? Going from the idea of like, I could never be at a small company to then taking an idea from thin air and then like see it build out, see us get our first customer and then our second, and then to start to see revenue coming in. It was like growing a child in some ways. I don't have children, but like this is my closest inclination to it. I'm like seeing, like close really feeling it and like seeing something happen from nothing in many ways. And then the goal of Area 120 companies is to be back at Google, to integrate back into the Google hub. Byteboard was doing really, really well with external customers. We had signed on Lyft and Betterment and Figma, like these very, very heavy hitting brands, these really strong engineering teams that were dependent on Byteboard for their hiring. And it was making a huge impact from a DE&I perspective as well, because they were opening up their top of funnel in terms of candidates coming in through their interviewing pipeline and offering them the Byteboard interview to take. And so more candidates were getting a chance to interview at companies that prior might have been screened out because of a lack of engineering resources or because of things not being clearly written out on their resumes. And so we were able to make the case that Byteboard should spin out of Google and become an independent company. And at that point, I had so much invested in this product and this team in Byteboard that I didn't like intentionally maybe sit down and ask the question of like, am I going to go and fundraise and like make this an independent company and say goodbye to Google? It was just like the obvious thing to do for the business was to take it to the next level. So I'll save the 14 months that it took to make that happen. Big companies don't tend to spin out tiny little companies. easily. But thankfully we were able to do that. And then for the last year and some change, we've been, I fundraise, which is a whole separate story. It's not something that I recommend for anyone, but it's a necessary evil. And have now been building Byteboard as a fully external independent company.
You mentioned like fundraising is a whole other story. I'd love to hear at least one good story from the fundraising. And what advice you have as someone with a technical background, you know, if you're to other founders, other people who might be trying to get into that practice of raising money.
There's so many lessons I learned while fundraising. I think we pitched ultimately like 46 venture firms in the span of a month while fundraising. And it was back to back telling the story. And I think I went through like 26 iterations of our deck while pitching, because every story you're like, oh, they asked this question, and like need to incorporate that into the story and how you pitch it. In many ways, it was similar to interview practice. The advice I got for interviewing and for fundraising was like cue the firms and the companies that you really want to hit at the end of your cycle, when you're like your confidence is up, you know the game, you can play it really well. And so really, really staggering it in that length is really important. One of the best advice that I got that resonates with me after the fact, and it was harder to accept it while going through fundraising, that ultimately you are in control. As the founder, you're the one in control. They're the ones who want to buy into your company. They're the ones who, want to ultimately be a part of this. And so often that gets lost, especially as a first-time founder, as I was going through this and pitching to so many investors who are drilling you with questions, and then ultimately like trying to play the game to get you to accept their terms. I had to like take a moment near the end where it was becoming really, really mentally exhausting to know, like, what do I want to build? Why do I want to build it? What do I want to see with Byteboard? And know that I was in control, and I was handing over a lot of my control through the process to the investors. That wasn't healthy.
Yeah, you mentioned like the minds, just getting in the mindset of that you have the power. I think do you think a lot of founders, I shouldn't make an assumption, but do you think a lot of founders have the impression that they're the ones in the lesser position of lesser power?
I think I'm like excited to fundraise again to some degree, because I've like gone through it for the first time, and I'm like, oh, I know all the tricks. I know all the things that I can control for now and have more of a direct understanding for. And that this advice around like you are in control came from like founders who had already done this before, from founders who'd be like, hey, if you hear a no, that's just a no. Like this is not a no to your business. There's so many investors out there. They have some arbitrary way of assessing the business that feels good for them and their LPs. Like this is a grind game, a numbers game. It's not a one and done game. And again, it's so similar to interviews, because particularly when, there's been studies done that women are 5 times more likely to quit software engineering after a bad interview experience than men, for example. But at any one time, like of like 4 interviews that you take, your likelihood to bomb at least one interview is equal among everyone. Like all interviews are not made equal. There's, as I've talked about, there's so much arbitrariness to the traditional way of interviewing, but the confidence that you get hit on when you hear a rejection, like really, really pushes you towards one direction or the other. And to note that like interviews don't define how great of a software engineer you are, right? Interviews, it's just an isolated experience in some ways of like that not going well or you learning from it. Was similarly in fundraising, right? Like knowing this wasn't a fit for this VC, but there's there's more out there. And like, if I really truly believe in Byteboard and what it's building, I'm going to keep telling that story. I'm going to keep going out there. It's so much of a mental game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I mean, and thanks for being transparent about your experience, because it's wonderful to hear. And I think it'll be helpful to, especially to the TNS audience. But it sounds like, and I love that you compare your actual company that you built to the tech interview process. And it seems like Heather, when she was writing her notes, but it's a roller coaster. She uses that word roller coaster, and getting funding and just starting a business, just as it would be for a tech interview. So one of the questions that we had was, I mean, in terms of hiring, getting back to your journey, in terms of hiring, especially this decade so far, with the great resignation and job switching and hiring ramp ups, and now followed by layoffs, by big companies in particular, what impact has this had on Byteboard in terms of customer demand?
Lots of changes.
I can imagine.
The biggest one that's like most easily to explain, like for, since when we started Byteboard, particularly post-COVID peak as well with great resignation, what we saw was a candidate-driven market, right? You had so many open jobs in the market, and you had companies that were trying to find great candidates and competing for candidates very, very actively. So in that market, having a great candidate experience became a vital, something that was super vital as a company to have, because if you didn't have a great candidate experience, this candidate was going to move on to the next company that was looking for them. And so you really, really had to compete on making a great decision on if you were going to hire this candidate or not in a very short amount of time, and then competing on a number of offers with that candidate. So when we had companies like Figma using Byteboard, they were able to actually cut down their time to offer from interview to offer time by over 2 months. Because they had sped up that process with Byteboard. They were getting really strong understanding of if they're going to move forward with that candidate or not, and then getting to a really confident hire, no hire decision at the end of it. And then with kind of the huge shift in the last 6 to 8 months, you're seeing the flip. You're seeing more candidates on the market now and fewer jobs. And so what the problem there becomes is, yes, candidate experience is always important, but now companies have a choice of like a number of candidates that they can interview for their position. What the problem becomes is the signal to noise ratio. You have thousands of applications coming in. I remember I was just talking to a founder last week who was hiring for a role 8 months ago, and then they were hiring for that same role now. And they said they were like begging for candidates 8 months ago to try to apply to their role. And this time, within a week, they had to close the rec because they had such a flood of candidates coming in and applying. And in that same case today, Byteboard becomes really important to help them identify that noise to signal ratio, right? Like it helps you find kind of that hidden gem amongst a really large population of candidates coming through. And it's really helping save, a lot of companies have had to do layoffs, but they might still be hiring. The layoffs have hit the recruiting teams. And so the more and more that they can lean on tools like Byteboard to help them interview and find that right fit candidate, versus getting a recruiter or having engineering managers sort through resumes and assess interviews one by one, becomes really, really vital to have something that they can trust from an interview perspective, a tool like Byteboard to help them find that great candidate.
One more question about trends, trends in recruiting and in the interview process. We know that AI has been part of recruiting for a long time, is vetting, filtering resumes that come in and so forth. Do you foresee, we now obviously Chat GPT is all the news, and Microsoft has a version of it, and and also Google, we just heard today, has a version of it. Do you think, do you foresee a role for AI in the tech interview?
Yes. Yes, it's going to change how interviews are done. Previously, you've heard this like AI being used for resumes and this and that. It's been very trepidatious in many ways because of the negative implications of using AI as a resume screener, using AI to filter out candidates. Because if it's trained on poor data, if it's trained on data that's going to bias to the majority of the population, it has ramifications that you can't walk back many times. And so with Byteboard, we were very clear. We actually have human reviewers for our assessments. It's one of the only assessments out there that has trained software engineers that is actually looking through the candidate's performance. We're not just putting it through a machine or an AI model and being like, this candidate looks good, like we're just going to pass it because of that. Like it's really important for us to have that quality check in place. Now, where I do think AI is going to change and like could be positively used is one, a lot of engineers on their jobs are using AI assistive tools like GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT to assist them in their day-to-day jobs as engineers. And so one of the questions we've been getting a lot among hiring managers that they're discussing is like, do we allow candidates to use tools like this as a part of their interview process? And there's a growing model that's like very much resistance to change. And no, we're going to like monitor your tabs. We're going to, have a camera looking at what you're doing. You're going to very much work on this interview as a silo. And inevitably, like, I don't think that's the direction you want to be heading in because people are going to find a way. And if they're going to be using it on their jobs, you need to find a proper way to actually incorporate it into their interview process. With Byteboard, because our interviews are so open-ended and like we're intentionally designed to be open-ended, you can look up stuff if you need to while you're performing the interview. We've seen candidates who are more junior candidates or actually don't have a handle on like the question itself. When they try to use ChatGPT or any other AI assisted tools, they actually don't perform well on the job. If you have a strong engineer that's already using AI assisted tools to help augment what they're performing, they end up doing really well. So you still need to be a really strong engineer to be asking the right questions, to be able to properly, effectively use these AI assisted tools. So where I see this changing and heading into the industry is a lot of the tools that exist today are a lot of the traditional ways that we do interviews where it's just like, here's a problem, like write me 10 lines of code for it. Like those are becoming obsolete, right? Like you just can't have that because that's just a spit in, spit out of what you can put into ChatGPT. You're going to need to start assessing candidates more on their fundamental skills of how do they ask the right questions? Can they understand to ask and dig deeper? And then use any other tools to assist them along the way. So how we interview engineers is going to look, these tools are forcing the industry to really evaluate what are the actual skills that we're looking for in our candidates.
We noticed that you announced on LinkedIn that this week you're going to be hosting a dinner with engineering leaders to discuss these implications, of course, of AI-assisted tools, which is fantastic. What are your key takeaways that you think that you want to get out of this particular event? And I think that goes along with our last question is what's next for you and your company? And I'm going to go ahead and assume AI has something to do with it.
Yeah, I'm so excited for the conversation this week. We have like a really great set of leaders from the AI team at Notion, from leaders at Dropbox, just like a really good community of folks coming together who are very involved in the interview process and building out great engineering teams. So I'm curious to hear what they're thinking. A lot of the reason why interviews have persisted the way they have, the traditional interviews I've talked about, is because of the ethos that the industry had, right? Like people were resistant to change. Someone who's not in engineering and might look at this and be like, you should have changed this years ago. Like this totally doesn't make sense. Like why have you been interviewing on a whiteboard? Well, for so long, it's just because it was the way things were done, or it was the way I was interviewed. So that's how I was going to interview others. So I'm curious to hear from this conversation, of what's the split between folks being resistant to it and being like, no, with evaluation and assessments, we have to keep it very, very isolated, and we're not going to use these tools, versus folks being like, okay, we are receptive to this, but this is the degree of which will involve AI tools in the interview process. Or I'm particularly curious to ask this group of folks of like, what are the actual values? What are the actual skill sets as an engineer you're practicing day to day? Because I can guarantee it probably looks even different than 5 years ago, what was expected of engineers. Every couple of years with new technology coming in, the skills that are required to be a great, effective engineer tend to change. And so what does that look like today will be really interesting. And that leads to what's next for Byteboard. It's, we were already at the forefront when we were thinking about completely dismantling the current interview process. We weren't applying a Band-Aid and being like, let me just make this process faster, but let me use a broken thing and make it faster for you, which is a lot of what the existing tools have done. We were like, no, let's start from the bottom and be like, what should an interview actually assess for? And have built it for that scope. So as we look forward, we're launching a security assessment and a data science assessment, a lot of different domains that the industry has been asking for, and leading into adding skills like applied AI skills into our assessments for companies to better assess for candidates that they're looking for in today's day and age.
And that's a wrap. We'd like to thank Sargun Kaur of Byteboard for joining Colleen and I today. Thank you, Sargun.
Thanks for having me.
This was fun. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it was not only fun, it was super interesting. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today as well. This has been Heather Joslin and Colleen Call for the New Stack, for the Tech Founder Odyssey series, and we'll see you next time.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.